Negative, K. Nothing further. Just see the cabbie in the corner.
In a world where love can quickly turn into betrayal, the line between trust and deception often blurs. One woman's heart-wrenching journey unfolds against a backdrop of whispered secrets and hidden motives. She devoted herself to her family, believing that love could conquer all. Yet little did she know that her greatest threat lurked within her own home. What was once a life filled with hopes and dreams spiraled into a nightmare, with deadly consequences lurking in the shadows. The truth emerged slowly, revealing the chilling reality of what love can become when twisted by ambition and greed. The story of Maria Munoz and Joel Pelot, a couple brought together by fate in Puerto Rico, is a poignant reminder of the complexities of love. Maria, a driven student, met Joel, a man 11 years older than her, and their connection was instantaneous. Despite the age difference, they found common ground and quickly built a relationship that seemed destined for success. Maria soon decided to move with Joel to the United States to start a new chapter in their lives together. As the years passed, the couple settled in Laredo, Texas, a bustling city of 250,000 residents. Maria had graduated with a nursing degree and obtained certification as a nurse anesthetist, securing a well-paying job in a hospital. Her colleagues described her as diligent, compassionate, and incredibly hardworking. But despite her professional accomplishments, her family always took precedence. After the birth of her children, Maria decided to quit her job and devote herself entirely to raising them and running the household. On the morning of September 22, 2020, a frantic call came through to 911. The voice on the other end was distressed, desperate, and filled with confusion.
911, what's the address of emergency?
Hi, I called my wife on her phone. She's not breathing. She may have taken some pills.
Okay, what is your address?
It was Joel Pellet, Maria's husband, who reported that his wife was unresponsive and showed no signs of life. He mentioned she might have overdosed on medications, though his explanation seemed uncertain. As the dispatcher gave him instructions on performing CPR, Joel tried in vain to revive Maria, but she wasn't breathing. Panic and helplessness echoed in his voice as he repeated the life-saving process over and over, with no success. The first police officer arrived at the scene within minutes. His body camera captured the unfolding events as Joel, clad in a blue surgical gown, hurriedly opened the door and led the officer upstairs to where Maria lay motionless. She was still warm, but there were no signs of life. Joel claimed he had already attempted several cycles of CPR, but they had proven ineffective. The officer joined in the efforts to save her, but their attempts were futile. During these moments of chaos, Joel mentioned that his wife might have taken an excessive amount of prescribed medication, specifically for anxiety, claiming that Maria had been battling mental health issues and had become increasingly depressed. He went to the bathroom and retrieved a packet of pills, handing them over to the officer, suggesting they could be related to her tragic state. Joel implied that Maria had been overwhelmed by her depression, potentially leading her to take her own life. Yet, something about Joel's behavior raised suspicion in the officer's mind. In cases of overdose, it's common for the individual to leave the medication packaging nearby, but there were no such signs in the room where Maria lay. No pills, no syringes, nothing to indicate that she had intentionally ingested a lethal dose of medication. According to Joel, Maria had been a devoted mother, taking the girls for a walk in the park the previous evening. As paramedics arrived and joined in the resuscitation efforts, another detail caught the officer's attention. Earlier, Joel had handed over the packet of pills, but when the officer later looked for them to take a closer look, they had disappeared. Reviewing the body camera footage, the officer noticed something odd. Joel had discreetly picked up the packet and hidden it in his gown pocket. Eventually, confronted by the officer, Joel reluctantly returned the pills. Upon inspection, the detective found that the medication, meant for treating anxiety, was mostly untouched. It was clear that Maria hadn't consumed a large quantity of pills, as Joel had suggested. So, what had really happened? 3 hours after the distressing emergency call was made, the medical team pronounced 31-year-old Maria Munoz dead. Despite their best efforts, they were unable to revive her. The situation, while tragic, immediately raised questions in the minds of the responding detectives, and their attention turned to her husband, Joel Pellet. His behavior was peculiar, erratic even, from the very start. He seemed anxious, on edge, and his explanations about what had transpired that night were inconsistent and strange. Joel admitted to the detectives that there had been ongoing issues in their marriage, to the point where they had been living separately for a while. Despite these issues, he had visited Maria that evening with the hope of reconciling their differences. According to Joel, the evening had started calmly enough. They had a conversation, which he described as peaceful, where they supposedly worked through some of their problems. After putting their 2 young children to bed, Joel claimed they had been intimate, and afterward, he decided to take a shower. Upon returning from the bathroom, he said he found Maria unconscious on the bed. Panicked, he called 911 and tried to revive her, but it was already too late. From the moment Joel shared his story, the law enforcement officers couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. They carefully observed him, and it didn't take long for his strange behavior to deepen their suspicions. Joel was sweating profusely, which seemed odd given that he was only wearing a light gown and the house was not particularly warm. His body appeared drenched in sweat, as though he had been under extreme physical or emotional stress, or worse, possibly under the influence of substances. This excessive perspiration, coupled with his erratic body language, immediately raised red flags. His story about what had happened seemed rehearsed, detached from the reality of the situation. Moreover, when asked about Maria, Joel painted a picture of a troubled woman battling depression and anxiety, someone who, according to him, refused any form of professional help. He mentioned that she had recently become more religious, seeking solace in the church, but even that hadn't alleviated her distress. He claimed she refused to see a psychotherapist despite his insistence. Joel suggested that Maria had reached her breaking point and might have chosen to end her life. However, it wasn't just Joel's odd demeanor that made the detectives skeptical. His account of Maria's mental state seemed exaggerated, almost as if he was trying to shift suspicion away from himself by painting her as someone on the edge of a breakdown. The detectives weren't convinced. Joel also told them that Maria had started keeping a diary, hoping to process her dark thoughts by writing them down. This diary was soon found during a search of the house, and it painted a much more nuanced picture of Maria's struggles. In its pages, she had detailed her fears and insecurities. She wrote about her anxiety over losing her family, her dread of how divorce might affect her children, and her concerns about her husband's growing distance. The diary revealed a woman under immense emotional strain, but it also showed that she deeply cherished her children and was committed to her family, despite the turmoil she was experiencing. As the detectives pored over Maria's words and tried to piece together her final days, they began considering various possibilities. One theory was that Maria had indeed tried to take her own life by overdosing on medication. Another theory was that it could have been an accidental overdose. Perhaps she had taken more medication than intended. But there was also a third, more sinister possibility, that Joel had played a direct role in his wife's death. When the police requested to search the house, Joel initially refused. He claimed to be a very private person, uncomfortable with strangers going through his belongings. This reluctance only fueled the detectives' suspicions further. They explained that a search would be necessary regardless, once a warrant was obtained, but urged him to cooperate voluntarily to expedite the process. After some hesitation, Joel eventually agreed, though his initial resistance had already left a lasting impression on the investigators. As they examined the house, the detectives continued to speak with Joel, becoming increasingly convinced that he was not in his right mind. His movements were erratic. He struggled to stand still or maintain eye contact. His constant sweating and inability to focus suggested he was under the influence of something. Eventually, they invited him to the station for further questioning, where his behavior only became more bizarre. Joel couldn't sit still, frequently bumping into furniture, and seemed utterly disoriented. At one point, left alone in the interrogation room, he broke down, crying and screaming, pounding the walls in frustration. The formal interrogation began around 4 a.m., and Joel repeated his earlier claims. He said that he was the one who had picked up Maria's medication from the pharmacy, though he couldn't remember how many pills were in the packet initially. While it's not uncommon for people to forget such details, his inability to provide clear answers about the medication only added to the detective's suspicions. When asked again about the events leading up to Maria's collapse, Joel reiterated his story about taking a shower. According to him, he had only been gone for about 10 minutes, and when he returned, Maria was already unconscious. But the timeline didn't add up. The detectives knew that the medication Maria allegedly took wouldn't have acted so quickly, nor would it have been powerful enough to kill her in such a short span of time. But it was the details about the supposed shower that truly unraveled Joel's story. When the detectives inspected the bathroom, they found that it was completely dry. No steam, no moisture on the walls or floor, not even a damp towel. It was clear that Joel had not taken a shower, despite his repeated claims. The glaring inconsistency, coupled with his erratic behavior, made it increasingly apparent that he was hiding something. During the meticulous search of the house, detectives came across disturbing clues that hinted at foul play. They found a needle, the type used for intravenous injections, and a medical packet stashed in separate parts of the home. Intriguingly, this type of needle is often used for administering IV drips. Equipment they also found in the home's medicine cabinet, along with other syringes and IV lines. However, Maria Munoz hadn't been prescribed any medication that would require intravenous administration. Her prescriptions were all for oral medications. This peculiar discovery deepened the detective's suspicions, as it didn't fit the narrative Joel had presented, raising more questions about his role in her death. To gain further insight, the detectives turned to Maria's friends and family. One close friend of the deceased came forward with crucial information. This friend, along with her husband, had rushed to Maria's house upon hearing the tragic news, intending to take care of Maria's 2 young children. It was during this emotional moment, while the search was ongoing, that the police interviewed them. They hoped this friend could shed light on why so much medical equipment was present in the house, particularly since it seemed irrelevant to Maria's treatment plan. The friend's account painted a troubling picture of Joel, one that contradicted the caring husband persona he had tried to portray. She described how, 2 years before Maria's death, Joel had undergone a significant transformation. He had suddenly started losing weight, only to rapidly build muscle afterward, which, to those around him, suggested he was using anabolic steroids. Alongside this physical transformation, there was a noticeable change in his behavior. Joel, who had once been a loving husband and father, began flirting openly with other women, even in front of Maria. His behavior became more brazen, and his social media profiles reflected this new version of himself. Where once he had posted pictures of family outings and shared moments with his wife and children, his profiles were now dominated by selfies showcasing his sculpted physique and posts bragging about his financial success. Joel even bought an expensive sports car that originally belonged to Maria and often flaunted it among his friends, boasting about his lifestyle. His family, once the cornerstone of his life, seemed to have taken a back seat, replaced by a growing narcissism. Things took a turn for the worse after the birth of their second child in 2018. Around this time, Joel developed an infatuation with a surgical ward nurse named Janet Abaroa, who worked with him and Maria at the hospital. Their relationship, initially discreet, quickly turned into an affair. Joel was so smitten that he took Janet on a lavish trip to Europe, where they visited Spain, France, and Greece. This vacation was a turning point in Maria's life. She had long suspected something was off, but had no concrete proof until she stumbled upon plane tickets with Janet's name on them. Up until then, Maria had noticed Joel's increasing closeness with Janet, but had convinced herself it was innocent. The discovery of those tickets, however, confirmed her worst fears. Her husband had been unfaithful. This revelation sent Maria into a deep depression. She struggled with her emotions, torn between her love for Joel and the pain of his betrayal. She confided her feelings in her diary, where she expressed her fears about the future of their family. Maria didn't want her children to grow up without a father, but the emotional toll of staying in the marriage was unbearable. Despite her pain, she tried to make it work. For the sake of the children, Maria was willing to forgive Joel, but only if he ended the affair and committed to their family. It appeared that Joel had, for a brief time, convinced Maria that he had chosen to remain with his family. He confessed to ending his relationship with Janet and even planned a luxurious trip to Las Vegas as a gesture of reconciliation. Along with expensive gifts, Joel tried to present himself as a man who had learned from his mistakes and wanted to make amends. Sadly, this was far from the truth. The Las Vegas trip and the gifts were all part of Joel's web of lies. He never intended to stop seeing Janet and, as the investigation later revealed, had been carrying on the affair for over 2 years, right up until Maria's untimely death. The detectives pressed Joel during his police interrogation. Initially, he stuck to the story that he and Maria had been having marital problems, but claimed he had done everything possible to mend the relationship. However, under the weight of questioning, he admitted that their marriage was on the verge of collapse and that 5 months prior, he had moved out of the house to live with Janet. While this confession aligned with some of the information detectives had already gathered, it was clear that Joel was still withholding key details. Detectives decided to pay Janet a visit. Early in the morning, they called her and asked her to clarify her relationship with Joel and what she knew about Maria's sudden death. Janet seemed surprised, although it was unclear whether her shock was genuine or a performance. The investigators informed her that Maria had died only 8 hours earlier, but they reassured her that they weren't yet treating it as a murder case. At this stage, they were simply gathering information to understand the circumstances leading up to the tragedy and to rule out any improbable scenarios. The search of the house and the mounting testimony from those close to the family painted a dark picture of deceit, manipulation, and betrayal. Joel's odd behavior, the suspicious medical equipment, and his shifting stories all pointed to something more sinister than the simple suicide narrative he had initially tried to sell. Maria's death was now far from just a tragic accident. It was the result of a complex web of lies and deceit, with Joel at the center of it all. As the investigation deepened, the detectives knew that the truth would eventually come to light, but they had a long road ahead before they could piece together exactly what had transpired that night. The detectives exercised caution, refraining from jumping to conclusions as they awaited the crucial autopsy results. These results would be pivotal in clarifying the precise cause of Maria Munoz's sudden and tragic death. Meanwhile, Janet Abaroa, Joel's mistress, arrived at the station for questioning. During the interrogation, she readily admitted to having been in a relationship with Joel for over 2 years, a detail that she seemed unapologetic about. Throughout this period, Joel had never once mentioned that Maria had any issues with substance abuse, nor had he spoken of her indulging in drugs or any self-harm tendencies. Instead, he often expressed his concern about Maria's ongoing depression, emphasizing how she seemed to be sinking deeper into her emotional struggles. The detectives subtly hinted to Janet that Maria's death was not as straightforward as it might seem. They floated the possibility that Maria had not died from natural causes, nor from a simple overdose. The investigators suggested that if Joel were involved in his wife's death, Janet herself might be at risk. However, Janet remained firm. She stated that Joel had never mentioned any intention to harm his wife, nor had he made any threats or derogatory remarks about her. She refused to believe that Joel could be involved in Maria's death, although she was visibly shaken by the idea that foul play was even being considered. Janet's calm demeanor, cooperative attitude, and solid alibi led the investigators to conclude that she was not involved in Maria's death, and they decided to exclude her from their list of suspects. Soon afterward, the forensic analysis provided a major breakthrough. No traces of pills were found in Maria's stomach, not even those that she had been prescribed before her death. This was significant because, as Joel claimed, if Maria had taken pills just before he went to shower, the medication wouldn't have had enough time to dissolve, let alone cause such a sudden death in just 10 minutes. The autopsy determined that the cause of Maria's death was massive mixed intoxication. This raised an important question. How had these drugs entered her system? The careful examination of Maria's body revealed a critical clue. A small puncture, indicative of an intravenous injection, was found in the crook of her elbow. This strongly suggested that the drugs had been administered via IV rather than orally. Blood tests confirmed that Maria had died from the combined effects of several potent drugs, although the precise substances had yet to be identified. The investigators ordered a full toxicological analysis to determine the exact cocktail of drugs that had caused her death. Unfortunately, they were told that this analysis could take up to 4 months, forcing the detectives to wait for more concrete answers. Despite the slow-moving toxicology results, the initial findings cast serious doubt on the theory of suicide. Administering drugs intravenously would have been difficult, if not impossible, for Maria to do on her own. Additionally, it seemed unlikely that a mother who found comfort in her children would take such a drastic step. Everyone close to Maria had stated that, despite the intense strain on her marriage, her children were her primary source of joy and hope. Friends and family confirmed that Maria had never struggled with addiction or abused substances, and there was nothing in her background to suggest that she had ever considered suicide. Detectives meticulously combed through Maria's personal diary, searching for any clue that might indicate her intent to end her life. However, they found nothing. On the contrary, the diary revealed a woman deeply affected by the turmoil in her marriage, but one who was determined to endure and overcome her struggles. The notes made just days before her death were particularly revealing. Maria wrote about her growing disappointment with Joel, especially after he moved in with Janet. Yet, instead of wallowing in despair, Maria seemed resolved to make significant changes in her life. She had decided to divorce Joel and was eager to move forward, raising her children on her own and starting fresh. This new determination made the detectives increasingly suspicious that Maria's death was not voluntary. It didn't seem plausible that a woman who was prepared to make a fresh start would suddenly choose to end her life, leaving her children behind. As the investigation continued, everyone who had known and loved Maria gathered to say their final goodbyes at her funeral. Despite the strained relationship he had with Maria at the time of her death, Joel attended the funeral as well. He was visibly emotional, crying profusely throughout the ceremony. At one point, he even kissed Maria's coffin, his face contorted with grief. To outsiders, Joel's display might have seemed like genuine sorrow, but to Maria's close friends and family, his behavior felt contrived. After all, it was common knowledge that Joel and Maria had been living apart and that Joel had been involved with another woman for some time. The stark contrast between Joel's public display of grief and his recent actions left many feeling uneasy. One of Maria's close friends, who had been privy to the couple's troubles, could no longer hold back her frustration. Watching Joel sob over Maria's coffin, she confronted him, accusing him of insincerity. She voiced what many others at the funeral had been thinking but didn't dare say aloud: that Joel's exaggerated sorrow felt more like a performance than a true expression of loss. He had been living a double life, flaunting his relationship with Janet, while Maria struggled with the pain of his betrayal. Now, at the funeral, his overt displays of grief seemed hollow and hypocritical to those who knew the full story. This outburst at the funeral only fueled the growing suspicions surrounding Joel's involvement in Maria's death. The detectives, who had already been skeptical of Joel's narrative, saw this as yet another piece of the puzzle. They knew that until the toxicology report came back, they would have to rely on circumstantial evidence. But every new detail painted a more incriminating picture of Joel's role in the events leading up to Maria's death. With the forensic timeline set in motion and Maria's diary offering a glimpse into her final days, the investigation into her tragic end was far from over. The detectives were determined to uncover the truth, no matter how long it took. Joel's exaggerated sorrow and his erratic behavior only reinforced their suspicions. They had already begun treating the case as a murder investigation, with Joel as the primary suspect. His attempt to conceal the packet of pills during the initial search was a red flag, even though it was later confirmed that the pills were not linked to Maria's death. The needle found on the stairs and the medical equipment discovered in the house raised further suspicion, but none of this evidence was strong enough to bring formal charges against him. Even the forensic experts struggled to provide a definitive cause of death. In their quest for more information, the detectives turned to Maria's friends, hoping they might shed light on the events leading up to her death. Though they still couldn't prove who had administered the lethal injection, the conversations with Maria's close circle revealed some crucial details. According to her friends, on the Saturday before her death, Maria had a heated argument with Joel. She had grown increasingly fed up with his infidelity and demanded that he make a choice between her and Janet. When Joel chose his mistress without hesitation, Maria was furious. She stormed out of the house, got into her car, and declared that she would file for divorce. Joel's response was explosive. He struck the windshield of her car with such force that he shattered it, clearly unwilling to entertain the idea of divorce. On Sunday morning, Maria followed through on her threat. She texted Joel, informing him that she was looking for a lawyer to initiate the divorce process. Joel, however, responded with attempts to downplay the situation. He argued that hiring lawyers would be expensive and time-consuming, suggesting instead that they could come to an agreement on their own. He proposed meeting in person to discuss the terms of the separation without any legal involvement. Despite her growing mistrust of Joel, Maria agreed to meet him on Monday evening. Before Joel's arrival, Maria sent a message to a close friend, asking her to pray for her. Although she was apprehensive about how the conversation would unfold, she didn't feel as though she was in any immediate danger. She was concerned, yes, but not frightened. Tragically, this message would be the last time anyone heard from Maria. By early Tuesday morning, she was pronounced dead. For 4 long months, the detectives waited for the results of the full toxicological examination, knowing that this would be the key to unlocking the mystery of Maria's death. When the results finally arrived, they confirmed the detectives' worst fears. Maria's blood contained traces of 7 powerful drugs, including morphine, propofol, etomidate, and lidocaine. This dangerous mixture of drugs, commonly used in surgical settings, had been administered intravenously. None of the medications found in her system were substances to which Maria had access, but her husband certainly did. Joel, a hospital worker, would have had access to these drugs, strengthening the detectives' belief that he was involved in his wife's death. Armed with this information, the detectives felt they had enough to arrest Joel. Within an hour of receiving the toxicology results, police officers arrived at Joel's home, where he was spending the evening with Janet. He didn't resist when they handcuffed him, maintaining a calm, stoic demeanor as he was led away. At the station, however, Joel refused to testify and immediately demanded a lawyer, refusing to provide any further information about the events leading up to Maria's death. The prosecution, meanwhile, wasted no time in building their case. They believed that Joel had prepared the lethal cocktail of drugs and injected it into Maria intravenously. But despite their growing confidence in Joel's guilt, there remained one key mystery. How had Joel managed to administer the injection? There was no direct evidence to suggest that Maria had been forcibly injected, nor were there any signs that she had been drugged or restrained before her death. To answer this question, the detectives turned to Joel's former boss, an anesthesiologist who had worked with Joel for many years. When the detectives showed him the list of drugs found in Maria's blood, the doctor was stunned. He was especially alarmed by the presence of propofol, a powerful anesthetic that can be fatal if not carefully administered. In fact, the amount of propofol in Maria's system was far higher than any dosage typically used, even in major surgeries. According to the anesthesiologist, the dose was not only lethal but excessive. So much so that it seemed the killer wanted to ensure there would be no chance of survival. With this chilling revelation, the detectives realized they needed to revisit Janet. Her initial interrogation had cleared her as a suspect, but they now believed she might know more than she had let on. They obtained a warrant to search her home, hoping to find evidence linking her to the crime. However, the search yielded nothing. There were no needles, no vials of medication, and no physical evidence to tie Janet to Maria's death. Realizing they needed her cooperation, the detectives offered Janet a deal: immunity from prosecution in exchange for full disclosure of what she knew about Joel's actions. This time, Janet was more forthcoming. In the presence of her lawyers, she confessed that Joel had been bringing medications home from work for months. He would often use some of the drugs himself, though she wasn't always sure why. Janet named several of the drugs he had brought home, and to the detective's surprise, 6 of them matched the substances found in Maria's blood. After a moment of hesitation, Janet added one final, crucial detail. Shortly before Maria's death, Joel had brought home a vial of propofol. This revelation was the final piece of the puzzle. With Janet's testimony and the toxicology report, the prosecution had enough to formally charge Joel with the murder of his wife. They now believed that Joel had prepared the deadly mixture of drugs and either through deception or force, injected them into Maria, ensuring her death. Janet's admission about the propofol not only corroborated the toxicology findings, but also provided a direct link between Joel and the fatal drugs. With this new evidence, the prosecution was confident that they could prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Joel had murdered his wife. Pending the trial, Joel was initially released on bail, but his freedom was short-lived. Soon after, he was detained again and charged with falsifying evidence in an apparent attempt to hinder the investigation. His second release on bail raised eyebrows, but strict conditions were imposed, including house arrest until the trial, which began in March 2023. This trial was bound to be complex, with no direct evidence tying Joel to the murder, but the prosecution was determined to prove their case. They summoned over a dozen witnesses to build a circumstantial web of proof, hoping to convince the jury that Joel's actions weren't the result of a tragic mistake, but a carefully premeditated plan to murder his wife, Maria. The crux of the prosecution's case lay in proving Joel had a motive. They argued that the couple's deteriorating relationship had taken a nosedive 2 months prior to Maria's death, during which Joel resorted to physical violence. Divorce was looming, and Maria was determined to walk away from the marriage, taking with her a significant portion of the assets they had acquired together. This would have left Joel facing a financial catastrophe, with alimony and severance payments amounting to nearly $1 million. For a man like Joel, this was enough reason to kill. To bolster their argument, the prosecution presented Maria's diaries, which painted a damning picture of the couple's final months together. In addition to the diaries, they uncovered a vital piece of evidence: a video on Maria's phone from 4 months before her death. In this recording, Maria was seen speaking calmly to her husband in their car, attempting to reconcile and save the family. Joel, however, was visibly agitated and responded in an erratic and aggressive manner. The video provided a glimpse into the kind of relationship they had and Joel's volatile temperament. But one significant question lingered throughout the trial. How had Joel convinced Maria to accept a lethal injection? The prosecution believed they had the answer. They theorized that Joel had slipped a powerful sedative into Maria's coffee, rendering her more compliant. Once she became groggy and disoriented, Joel likely offered to help her by administering medication intravenously, something Maria trusted him to do because of his medical background. Even though the couple was in the midst of separating, Maria still saw Joel as someone capable of helping in a moment of distress. The sedative, combined with the lethal drugs Joel had prepared in advance, left her defenseless. According to the medical experts, each drug in the deadly cocktail could cause unconsciousness individually, but together, they ensured Maria had no chance of resisting or surviving. Joel's actions left little doubt about his intentions. The prosecution argued that he had clearly planned the murder well in advance, securing the medications and preparing the lethal mix before visiting his wife. Despite their lack of direct evidence, the prosecution had one key witness: Janet, Joel's mistress. She confessed that before Joel left to meet Maria on the day of her death, he told her he was going to give his wife an injection. Janet claimed that Joel did not intend to kill Maria, but wanted to calm her down to make her more agreeable during the divorce negotiations. While this statement might have seemed like an attempt to defend Joel's actions, it only confirmed his involvement in the fatal injection. Janet's testimony became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, cementing Joel's guilt in the jury's mind. But there was more. The prosecution also accused Joel of delaying his call to emergency services. They argued that Joel intentionally waited until it was too late to save Maria, buying himself enough time to dispose of the syringe and any other incriminating evidence. Joel's attempt to mislead the investigation by tampering with evidence only strengthened the prosecution's argument that this was no accident but a deliberate act of murder. During the trial, Joel admitted to giving Maria an injection, but insisted he had no malicious intent. His defense team argued that Maria had been struggling with depression, abusing alcohol and medication for months before the tragedy. According to Joel's lawyers, Maria had accidentally taken too many pills, and Joel had attempted to counteract the overdose by administering drugs to reverse the effects. Unfortunately, he mistakenly gave her propofol, which exacerbated her condition rather than alleviating it. They claimed Joel's actions were an honest mistake, a tragic accident rather than premeditated murder. After 8 intense days of testimony, on March 30th, 2023, the jury deliberated for less than an hour. The speed of their decision reflected the strength of the prosecution's case. Joel Pellet, 45 years old, was found guilty of the premeditated murder of Maria Munoz. He was also convicted of falsifying evidence in an attempt to obstruct the investigation. For these crimes, Joel was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole in 2053. An additional 10 years were tacked onto his sentence for his efforts to conceal the evidence of the crime.
New this hour, investigators tell us they also plan to commit more murders.
This is a story that will leave no one indifferent. This is a story that will make your blood run cold. In a small, quiet town, where everyone knew everyone, no one could have predicted the horrors that would unfold there. What began as a seemingly innocuous day turned into a chilling tale of betrayal, greed, and violence. The perpetrators' motives were as twisted as their methods, fueled by a strange mixture of love, rage, resentment, and a thirst for freedom. The first victims were chosen not for wealth or power, but because they simply stood in the way. Their crimes were horrific and insidious, leaving a trail of destruction that stained everything they touched. The police found scenes more horrific and shocking than they had ever seen. However, what shocked the police most was not only the cruelty, violence, or inhumanity, but also the complete lack of remorse on the part of one of the criminals. In the spring of 2017, a series of shockingly brutal crimes shattered the tranquility of Lawrenceville, a quiet town nestled in the heart of Georgia. These gruesome events claimed the lives of 2 individuals and left 4 others gravely injured, hovering on the brink of death. Among the victims was an elderly couple who endured unimaginable torture and were ultimately beaten to death in a horrific act of violence motivated by greed. 2 college students, severely wounded in the spree, survived by sheer luck. The perpetrators of this chilling crime wave were 2 young lovers, 17-year-old Cassandra Bjorga and 19-year-old Johnny Ryder. Their dark love story quickly captured the media's attention, drawing comparisons to the tragic romance of Romeo and Juliet. However, in a disturbing turn of events, their crime spree was even more horrific as their intended targets were members of their own families, people who once loved and cared for them. In a twisted plot, they sought to get rid of everyone close to them. Their romance began innocently enough, with a chance meeting in late January 2017 through mutual friends. Cassandra, 17 at the time, was still a student, while Johnny, just 19, was already nursing the emotional scars of a failed marriage. His brief marriage had been forced by circumstance when his underage girlfriend became pregnant. However, the pregnancy tragically ended early, and the marriage quickly fell apart. When Johnny first laid eyes on Cassandra, he was mesmerized, falling deeply and madly in love with her from the very first moment. Despite her petite, almost angelic appearance, Cassandra was a whirlwind of fierce, untamed energy. She had previously dedicated herself to intense physical pursuits, including competitive tango, taekwondo, and wushu. She was no stranger to martial arts competitions and showed promise in these fields. But her commitment waned as emotional turmoil took hold. In truth, it wasn't just emotional struggles that pulled her away from her athletic ambitions. She had become more drawn to the party scene, developing habits and behaviors that were in stark contrast to the disciplined lifestyle required for her sports. Her striking beauty and magnetic personality allowed her to captivate those around her, particularly the boys who were helplessly drawn into her orbit. Some now question whether Cassandra truly loved Johnny, or if she merely manipulated him to fulfill her own sinister desires. Yet one thing was clear. Johnny was utterly enthralled by her, blindly devoted and willing to do anything she asked, convinced that he had found his one true love and soulmate. At the time, Johnny was living at home with his mother and 2 sisters, while Cassandra lived with her doting grandparents, who cherished their only granddaughter. Not long after their fateful meeting, the young couple's passion for one another ignited into a full-blown affair. Eager to solidify their bond, they introduced each other to their respective families, hoping for acceptance and understanding. However, their families were far from approving. This rejection seemed to fuel a deep resentment within the couple, sparking a dangerous rage that would soon turn deadly. It's widely believed that neither Cassandra nor Johnny would have committed such heinous crimes on their own. But together, they became a deadly combination. Johnny, easily influenced and vulnerable to manipulation, was drawn into Cassandra's dark orbit. She became the mastermind behind the horrific events that followed, planting seeds of terrifying ideas that Johnny would carry out without hesitation. Cassandra Bjorg was born on January 18, 2000 in Peachtree Corners, Gwinnett County, Georgia. Raised by her single mother, Amanda Sterling, Cassandra never knew her biological father and had no contact with him throughout her life. Amanda, more absorbed in her own personal affairs than in parenting, struggled to provide the guidance and support her daughter desperately needed. This lack of stability at home contributed to Cassandra's early behavioral problems, and by a young age, she began exhibiting signs of aggression and defiance. When Cassandra turned 15, her mother married a man named Stephen. Unfortunately, this new chapter in their lives introduced further turmoil. Stephen began to show an unhealthy interest in Cassandra, making inappropriate advances toward her. Desperate for help, Cassandra confided in her mother, but Amanda dismissed her daughter's claims as fabrications. By then, Cassandra's reputation as a liar and troublemaker had taken root, and Amanda, believing her daughter was simply seeking attention, refused to believe her. Feeling abandoned by her mother, Cassandra turned to her grandparents, Wendy and Randall Bjorg, for help. Concerned for her well-being, Wendy and Randall took immediate action and invited Cassandra to live with them. In October 2015, Cassandra moved into their spacious 2-story home in Lawrenceville, hoping for a fresh start. Her grandparents, who adored their only granddaughter, provided her with everything she needed, from a private room to unwavering emotional support. They believed that with enough love and care, Cassandra's troubling behavior would improve, and she would find her way back to a healthier path. However, Cassandra quickly took advantage of her grandparents' generosity. Instead of embracing the opportunity for a fresh start, she abandoned the sports and extracurricular activities she had once been involved in and began skipping school. She fell in with a bad crowd, frequently ran away from home, and started using alcohol and prohibited substances. Her behavior became increasingly volatile. Cassandra began stealing money from her grandparents, using it to fund her destructive habits. On one occasion, when her grandmother refused to give her the money she demanded, Cassandra lashed out, threatening her grandmother's life in a moment of blind rage. Between October 2015 and March 2017, Cassandra's escalating behavior resulted in more than 30 police calls from the Bjorga family. She would disappear for days, engage in physical altercations, steal from the house, and become uncontrollably aggressive under the influence of substances. Despite their efforts, her grandparents were unable to manage her erratic behavior. Still, Wendy and Randall held on to the hope that their granddaughter could be rehabilitated. They couldn't bring themselves to send her back to her mother or have her placed in juvenile detention, as they feared it would permanently ruin her life. Cassandra's descent into chaos accelerated after she met Johnny Ryder, a 19-year-old with a similarly troubled past. Their relationship only fueled Cassandra's instability, and soon, she tried to move Johnny into her grandparents' home. Wendy and Randall, already overwhelmed by their granddaughter's behavior, refused to allow it. This decision further strained their relationship with Cassandra, who became more defiant and reckless. The situation repeated itself when Johnny attempted to move Cassandra into his family's home, but his mother and sisters quickly shut down the idea and kicked the couple out. It was at this point that Cassandra and Johnny, feeling cornered and rejected by their families, decided to take matters into their own hands. They developed a dark and violent plan. Anyone who stood in the way of their relationship would be eliminated. The first step in their twisted scheme was to murder Cassandra's grandparents, steal their savings, and then target Johnny's family in a similar manner. Afterward, they intended to confront Cassandra's mother and stepfather, and once all obstacles were removed, they planned to flee to Florida with whatever money they could gather from their victims' homes. Cassandra knew her grandparents kept a significant amount of cash in their home, hidden in a safe on the second floor. However, after noticing that money had been disappearing and suspecting Cassandra of stealing, Wendy and Randall changed the combination to the safe, ensuring their granddaughter no longer had access to their funds. At the time, Wendy was 63 years old, and Randall had recently turned 65. The couple had been married for over 40 years and had built a life filled with love, stability, and comfort. They had raised a daughter, achieved their dream of owning a beautiful home, and looked forward to growing old together. They occupied 2 adjacent bedrooms on the second floor, each with its own bathroom, and despite Cassandra's increasingly erratic behavior, they held on to the belief that she could be saved. However, their unwavering belief in their granddaughter would prove fatal. On that fateful day, Cassandra and Johnny entered the home with murder on their minds. Armed with knowledge of where the cash was hidden but unable to access it without the safe's combination, they turned their frustrations into violence. The elderly couple, who had done nothing but love and care for Cassandra, became victims of the very person they had tried so hard to help. Their dream of growing old together was tragically cut short by the brutal actions of their granddaughter and her accomplice. Wendy and Randall had clung to the hope that they could change Cassandra's path. But in the end, their love and devotion were met with betrayal of the most unimaginable kind. Their desire to protect Cassandra from the harsh consequences of her actions had cost them their lives. What began as a plea for help from a troubled teenager ended in a horrific crime that left their once peaceful home drenched in tragedy. On the night of April 3, 2017, the quiet stillness of Wendy and Randall Bjorga's home was shattered by a horrific betrayal. The elderly couple had already gone to bed, unaware of the nightmare about to unfold. Cassandra Bjorga, their own granddaughter, led her boyfriend Johnny Ryder into the house. Armed with kitchen knives and baseball bats, the pair climbed the stairs to the second floor with sinister intent. Cassandra quietly entered her grandmother's room and stood by her bed while Johnny approached Randall and began striking him violently with the baseball bat. The elderly man, disoriented and frightened, didn't immediately understand what was happening. He was too stunned to defend himself as Johnny leapt onto the bed and continued the merciless assault, standing on his victim as he rained down blow after blow. Meanwhile, Wendy awoke to the dull, sickening thuds coming from the next room. As she tried to make sense of the sounds, she realized her granddaughter was standing beside her bed. Before Wendy could react, Cassandra stabbed her in the shoulder. Wendy, though in shock, tried to fight back. Her hands bore deep defensive cuts, but she was no match for her granddaughter's brutality. Cassandra dragged her by the hair into Randall's room, where Johnny was still viciously attacking her husband. Together, the young couple bound the elderly pair with tape and continued the assault, demanding the combination to the safe. Johnny pressed a knife to Randall's throat, threatening to kill him if they didn't comply. Yet even in the face of such cruelty, Wendy and Randall clung to the hope that their granddaughter wouldn't go through with her threats, believing she couldn't possibly kill her own family. But their hope was in vain. At Cassandra's command, Johnny began stabbing Randall in the stomach, showing no hesitation. Wendy, in a desperate plea for mercy, gave them the code to the safe. Cassandra, triumphant, ran to her grandmother's room, quickly opening the safe and finding thick envelopes stuffed with cash. She returned to Johnny, waving the money in the air, her excitement clear. But their greed wasn't satisfied with just the contents of the safe. The torture continued. Cassandra and Johnny, hungry for more, demanded the passwords to their bank cards, beating the elderly couple further to get what they wanted. It was during these final moments that Wendy and Randall seemed to realize they wouldn't be spared. They began saying their goodbyes, telling each other how much they loved one another, words that should have moved anyone with a conscience. But Cassandra later recounted this during her interrogation, coldly stating that the exchange of affection had amused her. Once they had all the information they needed, the young couple executed their final brutal act. They first killed Randall, stabbing him in the neck in front of Wendy, forcing her to watch as her husband died. Then, dragging Wendy into the bathroom, they continued their grisly work. Cassandra, in a display of twisted cruelty, bludgeoned her own grandmother with a baseball bat, hitting her over and over. At one point, frustrated that Wendy was still alive, Cassandra complained to Johnny that her grandmother wouldn't die. Johnny, eager to end it, then slit Wendy's throat, ensuring she had no chance of survival. After the murders, Cassandra and Johnny didn't flee the scene. Instead, they stayed in the house, living alongside the decomposing bodies of Wendy and Randall on the second floor. The stolen money gave them the means to indulge in their wildest fantasies. They bought alcohol, drugs, and anything else they desired, living in a haze of hedonism while the corpses of Cassandra's grandparents rotted upstairs. In their interrogations, the couple would later admit they wanted to try everything, and the money they stole allowed them to do just that. The thrill of their crime and the indulgence that followed seemed to give them no remorse. As days passed, Wendy's sister grew concerned. It had been several days since she had heard from Wendy, and despite sending text messages, there was no direct contact. The text messages she received were odd, especially since Wendy had poor eyesight and rarely used her phone for texting. The messages insisted everything was fine and reassured her not to worry, but they only heightened her anxiety. On April 5th, after repeated failed attempts to reach the Bjorges, she called the police and requested a welfare check at their home. A patrol officer was sent to the house. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. There were no signs of forced entry, the mail had been collected, and neighbors mentioned seeing the couple's car leaving for downtown that morning. The officer knocked on the door, but no one answered. Without a warrant, he had no authority to enter the home. Satisfied that everything appeared normal on the surface, the officer left, reporting that nothing suspicious had been found. Little did he know that inside the house, the bodies of Wendy and Randall Bjorga lay upstairs, while Cassandra and Johnny continued their macabre celebration amidst the spoils of their unspeakable crime. The horror wouldn't come to light until later, when further investigation would reveal the true extent of the brutality and betrayal that had unfolded behind closed doors. The young couple, reveling in the aftermath of their brutal crime, used the victim's car as their getaway vehicle, but not to flee, yet. Instead, they indulged in daily trips to buy food, alcohol, and other luxuries. They ordered takeout from restaurants, filling the house with boxes of uneaten spoiled food that littered every surface. Tables, windowsills, even the floor. The house, once a place of love and care, quickly turned into a scene of chaos and waste. Their insatiable greed meant that they soon ran out of cash, so they began withdrawing money from Wendy's bank card. But Randall's wallet, with its additional cards, remained elusive. A week after the murders, with their funds dwindling and reality closing in, Cassandra and Johnny concocted a wild plan. They decided to throw a party at the house, luring friends with the promise of money, alcohol, and illegal substances. However, they faced a gruesome obstacle. The decomposing bodies upstairs were emitting a stench so foul that it would be impossible to hide. Desperate, Johnny rummaged through the garage and found 2 cans of construction sealant. But before sealing the doors, they first had to mask the smell. They bought several liters of bleach from a hardware store and poured it over the bodies, a futile attempt to disinfect the scene. Then Johnny meticulously sealed every crack around the bathroom and bedroom doors, hoping the smell wouldn't escape. Despite their efforts, the odor still lingered, seeping through the cracks. When they called their friends to invite them, Cassandra spun a lie, claiming her grandparents had gone out of town, leaving her with plenty of money for a party. Yet her story raised eyebrows. Most of their friends were aware of how often Wendy and Randall had called the police to manage Cassandra's behavior, and the idea of the elderly couple leaving her alone seemed too far-fetched. In the end, only a handful of troubled teens showed up, lured by the promise of illegal substances and alcohol. Even in their intoxicated state, the guests complained about the overwhelming stench, which Cassandra casually blamed on a clogged sewer. The party was a shadow of what they had hoped for, a small gathering amidst the filth and decay of their crime. By the next day, Cassandra and Johnny realized they couldn't stay in the house any longer. The smell was unbearable, and the funds were nearly gone. It was time to leave, but they needed more money to execute their escape. This meant another gruesome plan, one that involved more of their relatives losing their lives. On Friday, April 8, 2017, the couple set their sights on Johnny's family home, planning to rob and murder his mother and sisters. Johnny, knowing their schedules well, used his keys to break in during the morning hours when the house was empty. They ransacked the place, finding some cash and valuables to tide them over. They armed themselves with baseball bats and bear spray, a highly potent aerosol designed to repel aggressive bears. Bear spray contains a powerful mix of tear and irritant substances that can cause severe burns, intense pain, and even be lethal to humans. Their plan was carefully thought out. They intended to attack Johnny's family members one by one as they returned home and eliminate any witnesses before fleeing. By the time anyone noticed his mother or sisters were missing, they hoped to have several days' head start. Johnny's younger sister, Melissa, was the first to come home from university that afternoon. However, to their dismay, she wasn't alone. Her boyfriend had come over to spend time with her while the house was empty. The unexpected presence of a second person threw a wrench in their plans. But the couple decided to press on, adding Melissa's boyfriend to their list of victims. As soon as the pair entered the house, they were alarmed by the mess and signs of a break-in. Realizing something was terribly wrong, Melissa ran to the phone to call the police, but before she could dial, the room filled with an acrid, burning orange cloud. The perpetrators had unleashed the bear spray, filling the air with a choking fog. Eyes stinging and throats burning, Melissa and her boyfriend struggled to see through the haze when Cassandra and Johnny appeared, armed with bats. The attackers swung their weapons wildly, but Melissa and her boyfriend fought back with unexpected ferocity. The situation quickly spiraled out of control. Cassandra and Johnny, overwhelmed by the strength of the bear spray themselves, began coughing uncontrollably, struggling to maintain their assault. In the chaos of the fight, the front door suddenly swung open, and Johnny's mother walked in, returning from work earlier than usual. She was horrified by the scene, her son and his girlfriend attacking her daughter and her daughter's boyfriend, who were struggling to breathe through the burning chemicals. Johnny's mother screamed and immediately called 911. Panicked, Cassandra and Johnny bolted, fleeing through the back door. In their rush, Cassandra dropped the keys to the stolen car they had been using, leaving behind critical evidence. Fortunately for them, Johnny had grabbed spare keys to his mother's car during the robbery, which they used to escape. However, they had abandoned the most damning piece of evidence, the vehicle registered to the late Randall Bjorga. The botched attack at the Ryder home was a pivotal moment. While the couple had hoped to carry out their deadly plan without a hitch, the arrival of an unexpected guest and their inability to control the situation forced them to flee before finishing what they had started. The couple was caught off guard when Melissa arrived home with her boyfriend. Their plan had been to silently attack one person at a time, but with two strong and alert individuals present, the situation became much more dangerous. Though the criminals immediately decided they had to eliminate this unexpected witness, their plan quickly fell apart. They overestimated their strength and severely underestimated the potency of the bear spray, which backfired on them. The attempted attack not only saved Johnny's family from a gruesome fate, but also marked the beginning of the end for the couple's murderous spree. Despite the vicious attack, Both Melissa and her boyfriend survived, though they were hospitalized with varying degrees of injuries and chemical burns. When law enforcement arrived at the scene, one detail immediately stood out: the abandoned car in the backyard. The car didn't belong to the Ryder family, and when the police ran the license plates, they discovered it was registered to Randall and Wendy Bjorga. This revelation was disturbing because the police had already been called to the Bjorga's home earlier in the week for a welfare check. At that time, officers had knocked on the door but left when there was no response, assuming nothing was amiss. Now suspicious, the officers headed straight to the Bjorga residence. After repeated unsuccessful attempts to make contact, they forced the door open. The moment they entered, the unmistakable stench of decay hit them. It was coming from upstairs. In one of the bedrooms, they found bloodstains on the bed and floor, and the closet door was ajar, revealing an empty safe. However, the most disturbing discovery was still to come. The door to the master bedroom was sealed shut with construction adhesive, requiring the officers to cut through it with special tools. When they finally gained access, they were greeted with a nightmarish scene. On the floor lay the decomposing body of Randall Bjorga, his hands bound behind his back, clear signs of torture etched into his skin. Across the hall, the bathroom door had also been sealed. It took more time to break through, but inside, they found the remains of Wendy Bjorga. Her body bore the marks of a savage beating, and her throat had been viciously slit. The house itself was a disaster zone, filled with piles of trash, boxes, and spoiled takeout food, which had been left to rot. Empty alcohol bottles were scattered everywhere, and the sink overflowed with dirty dishes. The police, familiar with the Bjorga household, immediately connected the dots. Over the past year and a half, they had responded to multiple calls from Randall and Wendy regarding their troubled granddaughter, Cassandra, who often ran away, displayed aggressive behavior, and frequently got into trouble. Now she was the prime suspect in their brutal murders. As soon as Melissa and her boyfriend recovered enough to speak with the police, they pointed the finger at Cassandra, identifying her as the likely mastermind of the attack. They also mentioned Johnny, her boyfriend, who had been infatuated with her and would probably follow her lead in any crime. With their identities confirmed, Cassandra and Johnny were officially declared fugitives. The police quickly issued a warrant for their arrest, and an alert went out for the car they had escaped in. After fleeing the Ryder home, the pair stopped at a store to buy 5 liters of milk. The burning from the bear spray was excruciating, and they were desperate to wash it off. The milk helped ease the pain, but the couple knew they couldn't stay on the run forever without a plan. Johnny remembered his high school best friend Jason, who had been like a brother to him during their senior year. Though they had drifted apart after graduation, Johnny thought Jason might still be someone they could turn to for help. The criminals showed up at Jason's apartment unannounced. He was startled when his former classmate appeared at his door, looking disheveled and accompanied by a strange girl. Their appearance was alarming, but Johnny spun a sympathetic tale. He claimed that he and Cassandra had been thrown out after a heated argument with his mother, who didn't approve of his girlfriend. According to Johnny, things escalated when his mother sprayed them with pepper spray and forced them to leave with nothing. He begged Jason for a place to clean up and rest, as they had nowhere else to go. Jason and his mother, both kind-hearted people, felt sorry for the distressed couple. They allowed them to use the bathroom to shower, gave them clean clothes, and even prepared a meal for them. Grateful for the hospitality, Johnny and Cassandra accepted an invitation to spend the night. The next morning, Jason's mother made breakfast, serving coffee and chatting politely with the guests. She asked if there was anything more she could do to help, unaware of the dangerous criminals sitting at her kitchen table. But the peaceful morning wouldn't last long. As they finished their breakfast, the unmistakable sound of police sirens filled the air outside. Jason glanced out the window, puzzled, only to see several police cars pulling up directly outside the building. His confusion turned to alarm when a megaphone crackled to life, and officers began calling out Johnny and Cassandra's names, ordering them to surrender. At that moment, the couple knew their time was up. The law had finally caught up with them. Jason and his mother were paralyzed with shock as the reality of the situation sank in. Johnny, now gripping a large kitchen knife, coldly thanked them for their kindness and then, with an eerie calm, ordered them to leave the apartment immediately. Terrified and unsure of what the desperate couple might do next, Jason and his mother bolted for the door. Meanwhile, Johnny and Cassandra scrambled to barricade themselves inside the apartment. They had no intention of surrendering, believing their only escape was to take their lives together. Johnny and Cassandra knew they didn't have much time. A SWAT team would be breaking through the door any moment, and they realized they couldn't hold out for long. Deciding that a dramatic end was the only option, they retreated to the bathroom, knife in hand. There, in a final act of desperation, they inflicted several deep cuts on their wrists, hoping to bleed out quickly. As Johnny began to lose consciousness, he took out his phone and recorded a voice message for his mother. His voice, weak and filled with regret, apologized for everything. He expressed love for his family, lamenting the hurt he had caused, and said he was about to die in the arms of his beloved Cassandra. This would be his final message to the world. Cassandra, however, made no such attempts to reach out to anyone. She remained silent, never sending a message to friends or family. Her focus seemed entirely on herself. When the police finally broke down the door and entered the apartment, they found the young couple slumped together on the bathroom floor, unconscious and lying in each other's arms, surrounded by a massive pool of blood. They were barely alive, but alive nonetheless. Paramedics rushed in to provide immediate medical care, stabilizing them before rushing them to the hospital. As soon as Johnny regained consciousness in the hospital, his first words were not of remorse, but concern for Cassandra, asking repeatedly if she was okay. Once stabilized, he was quick to confess his involvement in the crimes, expressing sorrow for what he had done. His confessions seemed sincere. They were filled with regret for the lives he had taken and the people he had hurt. Cassandra, on the other hand, adopted a completely different approach. She painted herself as a victim of her boyfriend's influence, claiming she had been dragged into everything against her will. She blamed her depression and anger toward life for her actions, using her mental health as a crutch. But as she recounted the events in more detail, she slipped up, accidentally admitting that she had long harbored a desire to see her grandparents dead. Her behavior during interrogations shocked even the most seasoned detectives. She alternated between childish whining about the hospital food and flirtatious attempts to manipulate the officers. When she finally agreed to talk, it was only after they brought her fast food from her favorite restaurant. What she said next froze the blood in the veins of the police. When asked why she had killed her grandparents, Cassandra replied with chilling indifference, "They had lived long enough." She explained that they were a nuisance to her, interfering with her freedom, making her go to school and hiding money she felt entitled to. Cassandra displayed no remorse for taking the lives of the only people who had ever truly cared for her. The only regret she expressed was that she hadn't been able to find her grandfather's bank card. When detectives revealed that her grandfather had hidden his wallet under his pillow out of fear she would steal it, Cassandra laughed and said, "Grandpa was always damn smart." The couple also confessed to planning the murders of Johnny's family. They wanted revenge on the Riders for not accepting Cassandra and for trying to break up the couple, thinking Cassandra was a bad influence. They also planned to rob the family, coldly justifying their actions by stating, "Dead people don't need money." Afterward, they intended to kill Cassandra's mother and stepfather, driven by a desire to punish them for how they had mistreated her. Their ultimate plan was to flee to Florida, where they dreamed of living by the ocean, spending the stolen money, and enjoying a carefree life. Months later, Johnny and Cassandra faced each other once more, but this time in the courtroom. The passion and loyalty that had once defined their relationship had evaporated. Instead, they spent most of the trial blaming each other, arguing, and hurling insults across the courtroom. Whatever twisted bond had existed between them had shattered under the weight of their crimes. Both ultimately pleaded guilty to all charges, including the murders of Cassandra's grandparents, the attack on Melissa and her boyfriend, and the robberies they had committed. The court found Cassandra Bjorga and Johnny Ryder guilty on all counts. Each was sentenced to 2 life sentences, with the possibility of parole after 60 years. In the aftermath, Johnny showed genuine remorse, standing up in court to apologize to everyone he had wronged, his voice trembling as he took full responsibility for the horror he had helped unleash. Cassandra, in stark contrast, remained defiant until the very end. When given the chance to speak, she coldly said, "I have nothing to apologize for." With that, the case of the 2 young criminals came to a close, but the damage they had done would haunt their victims and their families for a lifetime. It began as an ordinary evening of laughter and the clink of glasses, but darkness crept in, bringing with it sinister developments. What seemed like an ordinary night quickly degenerated into a scene of violence, shock, and despair, fueled by carefully concealed malice. As the clock ticked past midnight, the whispers of the party gave way to a chilling silence. When the police arrived, they were confronted with a scene of unimaginable destruction and a growing sense of incomprehension. Amid the smoke and ruins, a young woman's life had been brutally taken, and the ensuing fire was no accident, but a deliberate attempt to erase the evidence. The discovery of bloodstains and bloodied clothing suggested a terrible struggle for life. As events unfolded, horrifying details began to emerge. Was the woman's death the result of a ruthless arson attack to cover up the crime? Or was a more sinister and cold personality behind it? The investigation, which began as a routine fire case, soon turned into a complex and dark detective quest. Suspicion began to fall on several people, each with their own secret. With each new piece of evidence and each new interrogation, the horror surrounding the crime thickened, and despite the best efforts of the police, the investigation only deepened the mystery shrouding this tragedy. The worst thing for everyone was the assumption that this looked like the actions of a psychopath. The police examined the campus CCTV footage, but it was of no help. The neighborhood was searched for a red Nissan car with a fraternity sticker spotted near the crime scene. Police interviewed all witnesses, especially fraternity members and other residents of nearby houses. The officers were later approached by 2 guys named Nicholas and Moore. They reported a theft. The guys said that their laptop and speakers had been stolen, and one of them also claimed to be missing the keys to a red-colored Nissan car. Suspiciously, all of this happened on the same night that a young girl died. Furthermore, the burglarized apartment was located literally across the street from the campus room that was set on fire. To understand how the events of that night unfolded, police had to delve into the secrets that remained hidden under a veil of fear and cruelty. Every testimony, every piece of evidence, could be the key to unlocking the truth. Chicago is the most populous city in the U.S. state of Illinois and the Midwestern United States. With a population of about 3 million, it is the 3rd most populous city in the United States after New York and Los Angeles. Andrea Delvesco was born in this city in 1994. For her parents, Arthur and Leslie, the girl became the middle child. By the time of her birth, her older brother James was 2 years old, and a younger sister named Alexis came 4 years after Andrea's birth. It was a happy, loving family that moved several times, and eventually, they decided to settle in Austin, Texas. Andrea's mother studied finance and marketing at Southern Methodist University. After that, she got a job with American Airlines, then worked as an account manager in the residential mortgage department of Citibank. After the family grew, the woman quit her job to become a homemaker. Andrea's father, Arthur, managed the family's assets and was the owner of a holding investment company. Thanks to his activities, the family was quite wealthy and could afford a comfortable life. The family's fortune made it possible to send all the children to university. Before that, they were educated in a private school with a complex academic program, which was taught by the best teachers in the state. From an early age, the children broadened their horizons, covering everything from sports to religion, which helped instill high moral values in the youngsters. Andrea was good at school, played sports, and developed her all-around skills. The girl liked to go to museums and learn about art. At the same time, she was kind and sympathetic, sometimes even too much so, literally living in the problems of her immediate environment. A particularly close bond was formed with her mother, who did everything to provide home comfort. The girl and her family traveled a lot from an early age, which further broadened her horizons and allowed her to get acquainted with different new people and cultures. Having grown up, Andrea became a real pride and hope for her parents. Her younger sister looked up to her. Even her brother spoke proudly of her. In 2012, after graduating from high school, she applied to several educational institutions at once. The girl's parents hoped that she would enter the University of Chicago, where her older brother was already studying, and Andrea, for a while, really favored him. However, the girl decided not to hurry with the choice of an educational institution and waited until all the approved applications came to her. After that, from the list, she chose the Department of Psychology at the University of California, Los Angeles. This university was ranked among the best in America. However, studying in this educational institution required moving to the City of Dreams, Los Angeles. Her parents were glad that their daughter chose this direction and supported her choice, but they were worried about how their daughter would be so far away without them, all alone. Her brother would no longer be able to look after her. With the support of her family, she set out on her new life. Los Angeles, often referred to by its initials LA, is the most populous city in the U.S. state of California. With approximately 4 million residents within the city limits, it is the second most populous city in the United States, behind only New York City. When she arrived in Los Angeles, Andrea had to choose one of the clubs she was going to join, a fraternity and sorority. Student communities are known to be very friendly. There are entire neighborhoods on college campuses where large-scale parties are thrown that span several houses each. Many students here live so openly that they literally don't lock their house doors, so they can freely visit each other. It's safe enough here, but even in such places, various incidents sometimes occur. Andrea willingly participated in one of these communities. She had a terrific sense of humor, a pleasant appearance, and dressed beautifully. The girl's impeccable sense of style allowed her to become popular. In addition, she herself sewed various extravagant outfits, which time after time amazed the public. Andrea came up with unusual bright images, each of which invariably made her the queen of any party, where all the attention was drawn to her. The girl studied well, and after finishing her first year, found herself a job. The student became an assistant attorney at a law firm in Brentwood, where she dealt with administrative issues. However, this job did not suit her because of her busy schedule, so she had to find a new part-time job. She later changed several other jobs that would allow her to combine school and work. This allowed her to have her own pocket money and not depend on her parents. Andrea always dreamed of traveling after completing her education. Before that, there was not much left to finish the last course. During this period, she lived in one of the campus dormitory buildings located just 5 minutes from the main building of the educational institution. In September, the girl was preparing to start the final stage of her university studies. The beginning of classes was scheduled for September 24. Officially, the fall semester started on the 21. On September 19, the girl posted on her social media page one of her favorite music videos. She hardly realized at that moment that she was making the last publication of her life. Just the next day, September 20, 2015, was the last weekend before school started. The girls in the community were having fun on the balconies of the apartment complex. With her friend Jessica, Andrea took care of sorority organizational matters until 3 in the morning. Jessica then retired to her bedroom around 3:30 a.m. and went to bed, while Andrea made herself comfortable in the living room on the couch. However, this was her last night. A few hours later, another neighbor, Samantha, ran up to her door screaming about a fire. Andrea's door appeared to be closed, which was uncharacteristic of the girl. She always left her bedroom open to the rest of her friends. It was the norm in the sorority. Samantha couldn't open the door and called out to the other girls. Together, they all struggled to open the door, but the whole room was engulfed in smoke and fire, so they couldn't get in. They saw Andrea lying motionless on the bed, but they could not get through to her. It was very dangerous to stay there, so the students decided to evacuate the building. All the girls went outside, called emergency services, and reported the fire. The friends stood on the sidewalk and waited for help. When fire trucks arrived on the scene at 7:15, firefighters worked quickly and tackled the fire by raising fire hoses to the second floor. Andrea's room had a very heavy fire that took only 10 minutes to ignite. As a result, only 32 firefighters were able to deal with it, working promptly. After this event, information began to spread among students that Andrea Delvesco had died in the fire because she never left the burning building, and no one saw her. Firefighters who were finally able to enter the building found human remains on her bed. While investigating the circumstances of the accident, they concluded that the fire started spreading from the girl's bedroom. The body was badly burned, and it was impossible to identify it. In order to say for sure that it was Andrea who had died, the police officers could not identify the deceased immediately on the scene. Her face was unrecognizably disfigured by the fire. The only thing that was clear was that it was a female body. The police did not even have a chance to take fingerprints because the hands were too badly burned. Surprisingly, the girl's small dog was alive at that point. When the firefighters tackled the blaze, the charred animal, which was barely clinging to life, was lying at the feet of presumably her owner. However, it was later decided to put the dog to sleep to end its agony. All the students of the hostel were relocated to other houses. Meanwhile, renovations began in the charred building. The girls were frightened, so the university increased campus security. All students were already sure that it was Andrea who had died in the fire. All the others were discovered during roll call, so no one had any doubts about the identity of the deceased. Her roommates also claimed to have seen Andrea lying on a bed in the room engulfed in flames and didn't understand why she didn't get up and walk away from the fire. Thinking it was strange, they believed she may have lost consciousness at that point, suffocated from carbon monoxide, or may even have been already dead. At this time, the girl's parents had returned to Austin from a long trip. They did not suspect what had happened to their daughter in their absence, but they had already begun to worry as she had not been in touch. It was not possible to reach Andrea on the phone, so her mother contacted one of her neighbors. At that moment, the woman learned about the fire and that Andrea could have been the victim. However, the police at that time could not yet confirm the identity of the body found, and she was believed to be Jane Doe. Praying for her daughter's salvation, the entire family packed up and traveled to Los Angeles. However, law enforcement officials took over the case to verify all the circumstances. The police found out that Jessica, Andrea's neighbor, turned out to be the last person who communicated with her shortly before the tragedy. Investigators decided to talk to the neighbor to find out all the information about their last conversation. Jessica may have seen something. Detectives spoke with her to find out how the fire could have started, but the neighbor did not meet their expectations. She immediately claimed she didn't see anything and didn't know how it started, so her testimony was useless. The friends from the sisterhood, with whom the investigators also spoke, believed that Andrea could have fallen asleep leaving a scented candle lit, and it was an accident. None of them believed that the fire could have been started by someone intentionally. After all, Andrea had no enemies or ill-wishers. To confirm this version, it was necessary to conduct a comprehensive analysis of the scene. First of all, electrical appliances and sockets were checked for short circuits. However, everything was in order. No candles could be found. The only thing that looked strange was the trash can, which was located at the headboard of the bed. It seemed to the experienced firefighters that this was where the fire had started. It looked suspicious. Questioning her sorority friends, it turned out that the girl never slept next to the trash can. It always stood at the other end of her room and couldn't just move. However, it was impossible to identify the contents of the bucket without a thorough chemical analysis, as everything had been completely destroyed. Forensic scientists specializing in arson were called to the scene 2 hours after the fire had been extinguished. Police officers at that point were already confident that the fire was not an accident. The key object was a metal garbage can, which could have been filled with a flammable liquid and set on fire. For example, it began to burn at the headboard of the girl's bed. Then the flames spread to the ceiling and walls. Forensics confirmed their assumptions. When it became apparent that it was deliberate arson, the investigation became more intense. At the crime scene, forensic investigators found a large amount of blood evidence. The spatter was on and around the bed. Most of the stains had survived the fire. Given that the roommates called out to the girl when they opened her room at the start of the fire, investigators were alarmed that she did not respond and lay motionless. They believed she was already dead, and then the perpetrator set the crime scene on fire to hide all evidence. The police have reconstructed an approximate chronology of events that fateful evening. They interviewed many students, primarily the neighbors of the deceased. The last time Andrea was seen alive was at 5:50 a.m., when roommate Samantha was getting ready for work on campus and noticed her friend sleeping soundly on the living room couch. She then left for work and returned around 6:30 a.m., but Andrea was no longer on the couch. She had moved to her room, though this time her room door was closed, which was atypical for a girl. While talking to other female students who lived in the dormitory, the police got their first important lead. A girl named Sarah returned to her room around 5:30 a.m. after walking her boyfriend to the airport. Her dorm was directly above Andrea's room. It was still dark at this time, but when she tried to open the front door, she noticed a male silhouette. This was the women's quarters, although there were sometimes guys here to visit their girlfriends, so the presence of a guy didn't surprise her. But what alerted her was that the stranger immediately ran away as soon as the girl turned around, as if he was hiding from her. All this frightened her and confused her. According to the witness's description, the stranger was wearing a black baseball cap, a black and white t-shirt, and dark jeans. The girl was so frightened that she ran into her room and locked herself in it. As soon as she got inside, she immediately texted her boyfriend and told him that she saw some suspicious type. However, Sarah wasn't sure if he was dangerous or if she should have called the police. Besides, her boyfriend calmed her down by saying that it was probably someone else's boyfriend and everything was fine, so the student decided not to panic. Sarah went to bed, but around 6:15 a.m., she woke up to a woman screaming and a dog barking loudly and literally going crazy. These sounds were coming from the room below her, where Andrea lived. It really scared her, even though the dog had never barked before and had always behaved calmly. She realized that something bad was going on downstairs. The girl tried to contact Andrea to find out what happened, but her friend did not answer the phone. So Sarah turned to the emergency service, but they were distrustful of her words because it was a student campus where there were often parties, fun, alcohol, and loud noises, and nothing criminal had happened there before.
Just a couple minutes ago, I heard someone screaming in my complex. She's still screaming.
Nevertheless, a patrol car was dispatched to the address. The police officers arrived at the dormitory to check in around 6:23 a.m., but left within minutes without even telling Sarah what had happened. They just didn't see anything suspicious. There was no guy, the dog wasn't barking anymore, and no screams were heard either. The cops only directed flashlights from the street to Andrea's room without really looking or checking anything. They decided that someone had had too much to drink, had a fight, and the dog might have behaved aggressively because of that. Sarah, meanwhile, was looking out of her window. She called her downstairs neighbor several times, trying to reach her, but all in vain. Sarah also tried to call the other girls living in the house, but apparently everyone was asleep, and no one picked up the phone. Sometime after the police left, she heard a pop at about 6:45 a.m. The girl ran out onto the balcony and looked down. There was thick smoke coming from there. The girl also noticed that the same stranger in a black and white t-shirt whom she had previously met on the stairs had jumped down from her downstairs neighbor's balcony. She couldn't believe her eyes, and it scared her a lot. Sarah was afraid the guy had done something to Andrea. She grabbed her phone and started calling emergency services, explaining the situation, and went downstairs where other female students were already gathered outside Andrea's room, trying to open the door. Sarah didn't wait there and went outside, trying to track down the intruder. She saw him and chased the guy, literally chasing him down the street, but he was able to escape and got into a red Nissan car which he drove away in. Sarah remembered another important detail. There was a sticker on the back window from one of the fraternities at the college university. Meanwhile, the sorority friends had broken down the door to Andrea's room. The girls tried to shout to her, but she didn't respond. The students were ready to swear that they saw her lying motionless on the bed in the room engulfed in flames. Also, some of the girls noticed that there was blood on her neck, chest, and shoulder. However, none of Andrea's neighbors knew who might have wanted to harm their friend. Everyone loved her. She was not in a romantic relationship with any boyfriend at the time of her death. Detectives began to look into a robbery. However, nothing was taken from the deceased's room. They also worked on the version that Andrea could have met someone on Tinder, and the date was unsuccessful. The offended guy could hold a grudge and kill her. But that didn't check out either. There were no leads. The official conclusion that the charred remains belonged to 21-year-old Andrea Delvesco appeared only a few days after the fire. This was made possible by dental records that were requested from Delvesco's family. On September 22, an autopsy was conducted on the body of the deceased. The girl was wearing only a sports top, not even underwear. Therefore, experts had suspicions of rape. But this information could not be confirmed or denied due to the poor condition of the body. Most of the hair had been burned off, but there was a lot of blood on the surviving parts, especially on the back of the head. About 90% of the body was burned. But the most shocking thing was that forensic experts found several stab wounds, mostly to the head and neck area, which turned out to be fatal. 5 wounds were identified on the right side of the neck and 2 more on the left side. A total of 19 stab wounds were found on the deceased's body. One of them punctured the carotid artery, resulting in a rapid death from blood loss. The second stabbing, which also punctured the carotid artery on the left side, could have been fatal. Confirming that the girl died from the stab wounds was the absence of soot and carbon monoxide in her system. She was either already dead when the fire started, or it was almost immediately after the fire broke out. Obviously, the fire was not the cause of her death, but was a way to cover up the evidence of the crime. By this point, the investigation had already been reclassified as a murder case. A sense of fear and shock spread throughout the campus. On the day the official forensic report was released, police officers were able to track down the location of the stolen laptop and speakers, reported stolen by other students. Surprisingly, they were openly used by a guy named Joseph, who was located in Fresno, California. The distance between this location and the crime scene was more than 3 hours by car. The police immediately left for the address. Upon arrival at the address, it turned out that there were actually 2 Josephs living there at the same time, Marcaria and Garcia. The second Joseph seemed quite restless, which is why suspicions arose. The man claimed that he had not broken any laws and that he had taken the speakers from his neighbors. As the stolen goods were passed from hand to hand, the situation became more and more confusing. All of this led police to Albert Medina, a 22-year-old student who had loaned the items to Joseph. Albert said that his friends were moving, so they gave him the items for safekeeping. However, Albert himself was missing, and it was not possible to interview him. This could have been suspicious, but Albert had no previous criminal record. He was an ordinary student studying sociology and psychology at the university. His friends characterized him as a good guy. The police began their search a day later on September 24, but they managed to track down the likely culprit only on the 26th. He was arrested and immediately brought to the station for questioning. Albert began to remember his testimony incorrectly. According to him, he went to the University of California on September 18 and spent the whole weekend with his friend Eric Marquez. They attended a Chris Brown concert and had a good time. In the end, the guys came to a friend's party, and at that moment his speakers and laptop disappeared. The student eventually confessed under pressure from investigators that he was the one who stole things from these casual acquaintances because he was drunk and did not understand what he was doing. They returned home at about 5:30 a.m. But when investigators asked him if he had seen a suspicious stranger, Albert told something unexpected. According to him, when they were returning home with the stolen gadgets, they were attacked by a stranger with a gun. But they were able to break free, so the perpetrator did not shoot them, and they managed to escape. Albert's description of the attacker was that he was wearing dark jeans and a black and white t-shirt. This description of the intruder was very similar to the guy Sarah was talking about, but detectives questioned the credibility of his statement. During the interrogation, Albert suddenly remembered that his friend Eric had stopped by to visit a blonde-haired, beautiful girl he had met at a party that weekend. Eric was crazy about her. Her description, and even her name, matched Andrea. Eric had come to visit her for a reason, but for the purpose of intimacy. Albert himself was not with him in the girl's apartment and could not tell him what was going on there. When Eric returned, he was acting strange, nervous, and said that something had gone wrong. He admitted to hitting her and asked Albert to leave soon. He had plastic bags on his arms, which he then threw into a trash can, and a red plaid around his neck, which he then made Albert carry. Albert's testimony directly implied Eric's involvement in taking the girl's life and setting the house on fire. 5 days after the crime, police met with a new defendant in the case named Eric Marquez. He was also 22 years old and a fifth-year medical student at the university. Eric also had no problems with the law and was considered a good guy. His own friend, Albert, sent investigators to his home, which was only a 5-minute walk from the crime scene. However, it was not possible to get a confession from Eric. He claimed that he had been drinking alcohol all weekend and had hardly left the house. The investigators were sure that he was lying, and that's why he made up such a ridiculous story about drinking. To verify Albert's and Eric's testimony, surveillance cameras from the boys' home helped. Having checked the CCTV footage, it turned out that Albert's words were more likely to be true. The guys were awake from 3 a.m. to 8 a.m. and had been walking down the street and up to the apartment several times. Albert was just wearing a black and white t-shirt and dark jeans. Police discovered that at 4 a.m., Albert and Eric had left the house for a long time. It wasn't difficult to identify Albert by his conspicuous tattoo on his arm, but the key moment was when he returned to the apartment around 7:11 a.m. Albert had returned with his buddy and had a red plaid blanket thrown around his neck that belonged to Andrea Delvesco. The walk to Eric's house was about 5 minutes, which was consistent with the time of the arson. Also captured on the video was a red Nissan automobile that exactly matched Sarah's description. Then, at 7:30, Albert and Eric left the house to take out the trash. Albert was without a t-shirt, and Eric had changed clothes. The cameras captured this moment. Despite all this information from the police, Eric stubbornly denied and continued to claim that he did not remember anything. He did not remember his friend Albert breaking into the dorm and taking the blanket, although they walked together. But when the police received a search warrant for both of these bad guys' apartments and a thorough examination of their hands, the police arrested Albert because they found abrasions and scratches on him, which often appear during a fight, while nothing of the sort was found on Eric's body. Therefore, the investigators came to the conclusion that Albert was the one who broke into Andrea's room and brutally murdered her. The red Nissan used by the likely perpetrators was also found and towed away. In the car, they found bloodstains of the murdered person on the steering wheel, dashboard, and driver's door, as well as a lot of trash and one black sock. In the closet of the boys' apartment, police found a garbage bag with bloody clothes, Andrea Delvesco's underwear, and a black sock that matched the sock from the car. Police also found a bloody knife and a blanket from the victim's room. After all the checks, police had enough evidence to file charges. On September 28, both students were formally charged with murder and burglary. Albert was also charged with arson. The young man faced the death penalty. However, the detainees did not plead guilty. Their families demanded an honest, independent investigation because they did not believe they were guilty. However, all the evidence was against them. Now, it was up to the police to find out which of the arrested men was responsible for taking Andrea's life. The police managed to talk to Joseph Garcia, who was found in possession of a laptop and speakers. He revealed that he saw the boys return home that night. Albert shared with him what really happened in the dormitory. Albert broke into Andrea's room, who he really liked. He had previously seen her on a walk with her dog, so he targeted her. After sneaking into the hostel, Albert grabbed a knife from the girl's kitchen, dragged Andrea into the room, closed the door, and raped her, threatening her with the knife. She screamed and fought back desperately, so he had to silence her for good. He killed her and set a fire to cover his tracks, with Albert thinking he committed the perfect crime because he destroyed all the evidence and was proud of himself. Experts were able to identify traces of DNA. All the bloodstains on the clothes and in the car of the attackers matched the DNA samples of Andrea and the defendants. Later, another witness was found, a janitor named Julio, who cleaned the street near the dormitory. He saw a guy with a large tattoo on his arm, wearing a black and white t-shirt, get out of a red car at night and head toward the dormitory where Andrea lived. In the car, there was another guy sitting in the front passenger seat. Both guys looked drunk, were on their merry way, and laughing. The guy with the tattoo looked aggressive and started demanding Julio's help to get into the building, but he refused to get involved and walked away. Julio saw Albert climbing the stairs to the building but thought the guy just lived there and couldn't get into the apartment because of the late hour, so he didn't pay much attention to it. Investigators concluded that Albert snuck into the building, and Eric was sitting in the car. Blood found in the driver's side of the car also indicated this. The family of the deceased was shocked that the police officers called by Sarah were so negligent in their work. The patrolman did not even knock on the girl's room, even though presumably the perpetrator was in the room at that moment and killing her. The girl could still have been saved. An internal police investigation was conducted. In response, the Los Angeles Police Department stated that the officers had been suspended. The negligence shown by the officers who were called by the victim's neighbor was tried in court. However, the law enforcement officers were acquitted, although they were fired. By the fall of 2016, Eric was tried for aiding and abetting a crime. Albert was charged with murder, robbery, and arson. Both were also tied to articles for burglary as well as animal cruelty, as the victim's dog was injured in the fire. By September 2017, the death penalty was still being considered for Albert. His attorneys pushed for a plea bargain so the student would receive a less severe sentence and avoid capital punishment, but he refused to agree. The case was split into 2 trials. As a result of the sentencing hearing, Eric received only 2 years and 10 months after pleading guilty to aiding and abetting. It was proven that he himself was not involved in the crime or arson, but was sitting in the car the entire time. On May 15, 2018, the trial of the main defendant in this case, Albert, began. He went before the jury on charges of 5 different offenses. There was no doubt about his guilt because there was a lot of evidence against him, and this evidence was convincing. Despite this, Albert did not take a plea deal with the prosecution. On May 24, 2018, after a thorough review of the case, a decision was made. It was found that Albert committed arson, animal cruelty, burglary, and first-degree murder. The court ruled against the execution of the criminal and instead sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The court also added an additional 14 years for other past crimes.
911, where is your emergency? She's dead! She's shot in the blood everywhere! Shot!
With each new piece of evidence, the case became a media sensation, attracting widespread attention and the rapt attention of those who followed this horrific case closely. This is the heartbreaking story of a devoted single mother who was caught in a web of lies, deceit, and charm. The facade began to crack, revealing inconsistencies and disturbing details. Those who knew the truth watched with suspicion as he crafted his story, waiting for him to slip up. Doubts began to creep into her mind. Was the man she loved capable of something so heinous? Her curiosity got the better of her, driving her to dig deeper into his past. What she discovered was horrifying, a history of abuse and manipulation. Yet she was captivated by him, ignoring the warnings of those around her. It was only when he began to reveal his true nature, violent outbursts, threats, and moments of uncontrollable rage, that she began to fear for her own safety. Her love quickly turned to fear, and she knew she had to run. Durham is a city in the U.S. state of North Carolina with a population of 280,500. A quiet rental home became the scene of a terrible tragedy that shocked even the most experienced police officers and everyone around them. A young mother, Janet, was found dead in a pool of blood. At first glance, it appeared that she had been killed by gunshots, but the brutal reality turned out to be even scarier. Not only had Janet been robbed of her life, but also the life of her unborn child. This shocking event cast suspicion on the entire town, and detectives had no idea that the investigation of this brutal crime would drag on for years, gradually uncovering horrifying secrets. According to the testimonies of relatives and friends of the deceased, just a month before her death, Janet complained about problems with her spouse. According to her husband had serious mental problems. He too easily lost his temper and lost control. She repeatedly stated that she was afraid of him and was going to leave him. The victim's mother claimed that she had witnessed arguments between the couple on numerous occasions, but had never seen Raven use physical violence. When contacted by police officers, Raven admitted that they had had arguments on several occasions, but adamantly denied guilt. The deceased Janet was not just a victim of this horrific crime. She was a young mother, a loving wife, and a woman expecting another child. Her life, full of hopes and plans, was brutally cut short in an instant. But who could have committed such an atrocity? Raven, at first glance, seemed like the perfect husband and father. Young, charming, active in sports. So, what really happened that fateful night? Let's try to understand and place with you in this very complex and confusing case. Janet Abaroa lived with her husband and newborn son in North Carolina at the time of the massacre. She was 25 years old, but in her short life journey, she had managed to go through many difficulties. In recent years, the young woman had focused on building a solid family and being the best mother she could be to her child. Janet Abaroa was born on June 1979 in a small town in Virginia. Her family was very large. The girl became the 7th of 10 children. The family belonged to the Mormons, and religion from childhood took a prominent place in the life of each of them. From an early age, Janet was strong, independent, friendly, and possessed a sharp mind. She loved children very much and always dreamed of being a mother. Education was given to her without problems, and she had enough time for sports. In middle school, the girl played soccer, basketball, and swam. In high school and college, she played on local teams, particularly for the University of Southern Virginia. During one of her college matches in 1998, Janet met a young soccer player named Raven Abaroa. He played for the Southern Virginia men's soccer team. The young people instantly connected and fell in love. Despite her sociability and openness, the girl strictly adhered to the canons of her faith and kept her distance. The relationship lasted 2 years before the young man offered his beloved his hand and heart. During this period, the girl was 20 years old, and her chosen one was a year younger. They were married in August 2000 in the Mormon temple located in Washington, D.C. After the conclusion of the union, the newlyweds together began to build a family. The couple's first step was to find a job to gain financial independence. They took a job together as salesmen at a sporting goods store. However, for this, they had to move to the city of Durham, located in North Carolina. The young spouses began to rent a house in the suburbs and immediately began working. It seemed that the young people were happy in marriage. Outwardly, they were an ideal couple, as was told by all friends and neighbors. However, as often happens, much was done for show. Quite quickly, the young couple began to have problems. Janet repeatedly complained to her family and friends that Raven cheated on her with different women. He even once left home for a few days, but later returned. All this was given to Janet with great difficulty, as she dreamed of a large, strong family and children. The word fidelity was not an empty word for her. She was at a real crossroads because she sincerely loved her husband and did not want to break with him. Another difficulty was connected with the fact that sometime after the confession of adultery, Janet found out that she was pregnant. She dreamed of a large family, and it seemed that everything began to come true. But against the background of such behavior of the spouse, it was all weighing on her mind and frightening her. The young woman didn't want to be a single mother, but at the same time, she had no idea what to do about Raven's behavior. All of these circumstances added to the tension in the family. During her pregnancy, Janet became close to her neighbors and found several friends among them. She had company, and her new friends even approached her husband. They tried to convince him to stop cheating on his pregnant wife. Apparently, these words worked, as he promised to be a model husband. Despite the doubts, everything seemed to have normalized, especially after the birth of their son, who was named Caden. The boy came into the world on October 17, 2004, and completely attracted all the attention of his mother. She couldn't think about anything but being the perfect parent for her child. All this was happening against the backdrop of the financial crisis the young family was experiencing. They had money problems because the young mother was now not bringing in an income. The only breadwinner was Raven, but his salary as a salesman was disastrously insufficient for 3 people. The landlord of their house was understanding and gave them a 3-month grace period on their rent. He was sympathetic to the family because he realized that they were struggling financially and that a child would require even more investment in the beginning. However, despite the support, the young people could not solve all their financial problems, so they turned to the local church for financial assistance, and the congregation helped the young family. In December 2004, the situation became even worse. During this period, the son was only 2 months old, and then his father was arrested. He was arrested for stealing goods from the very sporting goods store where the young man worked with his wife. It turned out that he stole several tracksuits and managed to sell them on the internet. The total damage from his actions amounted to more than $10,000. Of course, the thief was fired. Janet could not bear the shame of her husband's behavior and quit her job as well. As luck would have it, Raven managed to avoid jail time. He was ordered to pay $15,000 in restitution to the store and was sentenced to 2 years of probation. In fact, both parents were left without a job and without money, with an infant in their arms. To get a normal job with a criminal record, Raven Abaroa could not. Despite serious difficulties, the young family struggled to stay afloat. They took on part-time jobs and accepted help from loved ones. Several months passed in such a state until fate dealt the young family the most crushing blow. On April 26, 2005, Janet picked up Caden from kindergarten. Together with her son, she went home to prepare for dinner. The husband arrived in the evening, had dinner with his family, and then, after his wife and child fell asleep, he headed to Morrisville to attend a local indoor soccer game. Returning home, the man realized that his house had become the site of a terribly horrible and bloody tragedy. Janet lay in an unnatural position on the floor, in a pool of her own blood, showing no signs of life. There were blood stains all over the house, as if a butcher had walked through the house. A small child lay in his crib nearby, crying. Fortunately, he was unhurt. Raven, in shock, immediately called 911 emergency services. He said his spouse had been attacked. She was covered in blood, but he couldn't understand what had been done to his wife. Raven assumed she had been shot.
911, where is your emergency?
My wife is dead! She's shot and there's blood everywhere. Shot? Yes.
Okay, you're going to have to calm down. How old is your wife?
She's 25.
I'm sending the paramedics to help you now. Stay on the line. I'll tell you exactly what to do.
When paramedics arrived on the call, they realized that Janet had not been shot but stabbed several times. The young mother died instantly from wounds to her neck. The scene of the massacre resembled a slaughterhouse, as the woman had lost a third of her blood. The entire room was drenched in blood. She died in her rented house, but it wasn't the scale of the bloody tragedy that was most striking. It was the fact that Janet was pregnant, and the baby in her belly was also dead. The police were stunned by the brutality of the crime, because the chilling picture was reminiscent of a horror movie. The police had to establish who could go to such cruel and drastic measures against a woman with a child. However, the detectives had no idea that the investigation would take almost a decade. After examining the crime scene, the body was taken to the medical examiner's lab. According to the autopsy report, the deceased suffered 3 deep stab wounds. One of them was located on her left arm and was clearly defensive. A 25-year-old woman was also fatally stabbed in the chest, but the fatal injury to her and her unborn child was a stab wound in the neck area. The attacker had severed an artery, which caused profuse bleeding. Janet Abaroa was losing blood so quickly that she was unconscious within seconds. Typically, with injuries like this, the victim dies within minutes. Given the relatively small number of blows inflicted, the medical examiner was unable to determine their order. Also, the expert found it difficult to give the exact time of death, as the body showed signs of decomposition. But the temperature in the room was quite low, which could have slowed down this process. At the scene of the crime and on the victim's body, there was plenty of evidence, which was collected by forensic experts, but all the materials needed to be thoroughly investigated. In parallel, the police were looking for witnesses who could point to the likely perpetrator. In the field of view of detectives immediately fell the husband of the deceased, Raven Abaroa, who was paid close attention. The young father of the family was repeatedly invited for questioning. On the basis of his testimony, they were able to restore part of the events that preceded the brutal deprivation of life of Janet Abaroa. According to him, on April 26, 2005, he returned home around 8 p.m. He then traveled to Morrisville to play in an indoor soccer game. Raven did not return home until 10:40 p.m. His spouse did not answer when he called out to her, so the man went to an upstairs room. Here, the head of the household saw his spouse kneeling in an unnatural pose. According to Raven, she periodically used this posture to relieve menstrual cramps. Janet was kneeling with her head on the floor, not moving or responding. Then Raven turned on the light and saw a terrible picture. The floor and walls were covered in blood. He turned his wife on her side and realized that she was dead. According to forensic experts, the specific position of the body could have caused the blood to flow simply by leaning forward through the stab wound until the fluid thickened. In fact, this could have continued for several hours. However, given the extent of the injuries and the severed artery, the woman could have been killed just minutes before Raven arrived. The police officers began to ask the man who he thought might have been behind the crime. Raven came up with an unexpected theory. In his opinion, the family had recently been in a lot of difficulties related to finances, and he assumed that, against this background, his wife simply could not stand it and took her own life. Raven said that sometime before her death, Janet began to behave strangely and often said that the situation was her fault, associated with Christian sins. The family and friends of the deceased took this as an absolute lie. They knew everything from Janet and were one of the few people with whom she talked calmly and shared her frustrations. However, she never voiced anything like that. Besides, the woman was very religious and would never do such a thing. By this point, however, detectives were already certain that she could not have voluntarily killed herself. The woman had sustained injuries impossible to inflict on herself. In addition, there was clearly evidence here to indicate that someone other than Janet and the baby had been in the house at the time of the massacre. A bloody shoe print was found next to the body, as well as a fingerprint. Neither the windows nor the doors were broken, which means that the victim voluntarily let the perpetrator into the house, or he entered it on his own. Either way, it was someone close to the victim who had access to the house. There were no signs of a struggle, except that one of the stab wounds was on the arm, which is typical of an attempt to close in from a blow. The attack was probably sudden, for the husband of the murdered woman claimed that Janet was already asleep before he left. Strangely, the only things missing from the house were Raven's laptop and 2 kitchen knives. One of them was probably used during the brutal and bloody murder. That said, the perpetrator had not touched any of the other valuables in the house and nothing had been tampered with. The young mother's valuables, including the rings, were still there, as were many expensive items that could have been sold on the black market. Since none of this looked like a robbery, therefore, the robbery theory was quickly discarded. At that time, there was still no evidence against the husband of the deceased, so he was simply released. However, detectives did not completely dismiss the husband's involvement and began to look closely at him. After what happened, Raven Abaroa began to behave even more suspiciously. Just a day later, he packed his bags, took his son, and left for Utah. At the same time, it could be quite natural, because to be in the house where the crime occurred, not every widower will be able to stay. Raven, at that moment, needed the support of loved ones, and it is logical that he went to the place where all his family lived. However, his siblings and the victim's friends he met with after the murder later admitted that Raven was not acting like a person who had lost a loved one. It was as if he was indifferent to what had happened to his spouse and not at all interested in who had done it. Raven was clearly not going to seek out the culprit and seek a just punishment. He did not participate in the distribution and drafting of reward notices or any other actions of the police and the loved ones of the deceased. The husband of the deceased simply left with the child and never again had any intention of coming back. Investigators noted that from the very beginning of the investigation, Raven was reluctant to cooperate and then simply ignored any requests. At the same time, the victim's family devoted every spare second to trying to solve this bloody crime. The first lead didn't last long. The police had a motive when they learned that after the second pregnancy, shortly before the crime, Raven had taken out a life insurance policy on Janet's life for the tidy sum of $600,000. The cops thought this was strange because the family had serious financial problems and had not previously taken out these policies. The money was not enough for the most important things, but Raven found money to pay the premiums. Plus, it turned out that the husband had applied to the insurance company for payment right after the attack, before the victim had even been buried. It all looked suspicious. In trying to figure out who Raven was, the police quickly concluded that from the beginning, his story of his relationship with Janet was surrounded by lies. During their acquaintance, he had told her that he was a devoted Mormon and had even taken a missionary trip to Peru. These were all lies, but proved no direct connection to the crime. During this period, Raven was living in Salt Lake City, Utah. The young widower was leading a quiet life, receiving insurance benefits and raising his child. Here, the man met and immediately began dating a new woman named Vanessa Pond. Their romance quickly developed, as the new lover was an educator and worked in a kindergarten in which the young father enrolled his son. They saw each other often and quickly found a common language. Vanessa had also been a single mom for the past 5 years. She was desperate to find her love and was going to devote her life to her child alone. But Raven was different from other men. Because of his friendly nature, he was persistent and able to attract attention, turning Vanessa's head and surrounding her with lies. The man immediately wormed his way into her confidence and confessed to his new girlfriend that his spouse had died in a car accident. At this time, Raven had no idea that Janet's extended family was watching his every move. They thought his behavior looked more than suspicious. The victim's family and friends wanted to find out what he was going to do next and possibly get proof of his involvement in taking Janet's life. The victim's loved ones quickly learned that he was lying about his former lover's death to everyone around him, claiming that his spouse had been killed in an accident. At first, the new lover of the main suspect trusted him completely and was not interested in the details of Janet's fate. However, gradually, curiosity took over. Vanessa was easily able to find information that the former wife of the widower was the victim of an unsolved crime. She learned that Janet died from 3 stab wounds. However, even here, Raven managed to deceive the naive lover, complaining to her that the police and the public were obsessed with the idea of accusing him of the death of the mother of his child, but assured her that he had nothing to do with it. His wife was killed by a robber. Amazingly, it all worked, and his new lover believed him. Janet's family learned that the dead woman's husband had started a new relationship. They contacted his new girlfriend. They warned her that Raven could be dangerous and advised her to stay away from him. But the woman didn't believe them. She seemed to be completely enchanted by this man and had complete faith in him. After 3 years of their romance, Vanessa and Raven were finally married. What seemed like a true idyll at first eventually began to resemble Raven's first marriage. His new bride also witnessed his mood swings and frequent fits of rage when he lost control of himself. The woman began to fear for her life when he raised his hand to her. Sometimes he even threatened her with violence. Their marriage lasted only 4 months when their love came to a sudden end. Vanessa decided to part ways with Raven Abaroa. Since the pressure from the detectives did not stop, Raven decided to talk to the press. The man expressed hope that the police would finally solve the case and find the perpetrator and then get off his back, but at the same time, he completely denied his involvement in the crime. During this period, a new detective took over the case, who was determined to get a fair punishment for the murderer of the young mother. Janet's family actively helped the detectives and cooperated with the investigation. Amidst all this, Vanessa's anxiety was growing. She repeatedly replayed in her head the thought of whether her husband could have killed his first wife, and she began to have doubts about his honesty. It seemed to Vanessa that he was quite capable of such an atrocity. The woman spoke to the media afterward. Vanessa confirmed that her ex-husband often behaved inadequately. The longer they were in the relationship, the more she became convinced that he was quite violent and aggressive. Although Raven rarely used physical violence against her, he was constantly on edge. According to her, the worst episode in her relationship with him happened on Christmas 2008, during another scandal, which was provoked by the man himself. He locked Vanessa in the bathroom and said that he wanted to hit her, hated her, and didn't care even if she died. This was the turning point after which they broke up.
I've been a single mom for 5 years. I know what it takes to raise a child. I thought, maybe I'll give him a chance because, he could be a fantastic father, fantastic husband.
He might be.
I finally fell for the nice guy is what I thought.
Vanessa stated that she was very wary of Raven and was sure he would take it easy on her, as he probably did with his ex-spouse. The new detectives enthusiastically took up the investigation and had to reconstruct the chain of events that had led the young mother to her death. They were also certain that Raven Abaroa was behind the crime. The main problem was the widower's alibi. On the evening of the crime and at the approximate time of the attack on Janet Abaroa, he was at the stadium and played indoor soccer. He was seen by several people who testified. In addition, the boot print found did not match the shoes used by the prime suspect. It was determined that the bloody fingerprint on the door also did not belong to the widower. But something about his behavior was suspicious. The detectives then scrutinized the recording of the conversation with the emergency dispatcher that Raven had called. One of the major errors was thought to be that the man had called the stab wounds gunshot wounds, even though that was obvious at first glance. Of course, this was not enough for charges, as he was not an expert in forensics and could have confused the two, especially as he was in shock at the time. However, the police did not believe him, as the young man was very clever and cunning, probably trying to play dumb to confuse the investigation. The new detectives called Raven to chat on the phone and ask him some questions. The widower repeated his story, but as before, could not recall many details. This increased suspicion, especially when he accused the police of incompetence. According to Raven, several knives were missing from his house on the evening of the attack, one of which he himself found later during a move. The man said that the police did not find it because they were working inattentively, and against this background, he doubts whether they were even able to find the perpetrator. At the same time, the detectives were sure that they could not have missed anything. The forensic officers had spent too long and too closely examining the crime scene. Unfortunately, in the years that the unsuccessful investigation lasted, the new detectives were no longer able to reconstruct the original picture of the crime. Investigators contacted Raven's other girlfriends, and they all confirmed that he was very aggressive and violent, which was the reason for the breakup of the relationship. Detectives also learned that before leaving the house on the evening of the attack, Raven had locked his dog in the garage, although he had never done so before. The man could not explain his action, but police believed that it made sense. Raven feared that the dog could defend his wife and prevent him from committing the crime, as well as attract attention to the house with his barking. Investigators also discovered that the day before the crime, the suspect had transferred information from his laptop to another medium. All this looked like preparation for the crime because the laptop was allegedly stolen. Based on a combination of new circumstantial evidence, on February 1, 2010, the young father was arrested on suspicion of first-degree murder and extradited to North Carolina. However, the material against the suspect was insufficient, all of it circumstantial, so investigators continued to gather evidence for trial. They scrutinized photos of the crime scene and the victim's body as police officers arrived at the house. The new detective noticed that there was an open, empty lens case lying on the table near the bed. This meant that the lenses could have been on Janet at the time of the crime. However, the parents of the deceased claimed that she never went to bed wearing them. Janet always took them off before going to bed, but Raven told the police that when he left for the football match, his wife was already in bed and sleeping with the baby, which means she had to take off the lenses. Could this indicate that she was killed before she went to bed and before Raven Abaroa left for the stadium? Unfortunately, the medical examiner who performed the autopsy did not pay attention to whether the victim had contact lenses on her eyes. This wasn't done on purpose. Often, forensic scientists overlook certain little things because they don't play a role in investigations. However, in this situation, they may have been key evidence of Raven Abaroa lies. To confirm or deny this speculation, an exhumation of the body was necessary. Janet's family was readily in favor of this, as they desperately wanted to prove the perpetrator's guilt and get justice for the deceased. In July 2010, the body was exhumed, and forensic experts did indeed find what looked like the remains of contact lenses on her eyes. After the forensic examination, it was possible to prove this fact despite the material drying out and deforming. But official expertise was needed to convince the jury. For this purpose, a large-scale experiment was carried out, which took a whole year. Specialists used pigs' eyes on which they installed contact lenses. Then they underwent an embalming procedure identical to that through which human bodies go before burial. As a result of the experiment, it was possible to obtain confirmation of all the conjectures. At the time of the murder, Janet was indeed in contact lenses, which confirmed her intention not to go to bed. All this confirmed the lies of the prime suspect. Raven Abaroa trial began in 2013. The case caused a wide public outcry and was actively covered by the media. It attracted the attention of dozens of people who wanted to be present in the courtroom. The jury was provided with exhaustive information about what had happened. The prosecutor's office stated before the start of the trial that they believed the husband of the murdered woman was guaranteed guilty of the crime. However, they had no direct evidence against the defendant, so the case was built on circumstantial evidence, which was to the advantage of Raven's defense. At the same time, the amount of material was so large that it was clearly meant to convince the jury of his guilt. The investigation uncovered another blatant lie on the part of the defendant. Raven stuck to his story that he found his spouse already dead when he talked to police officers. However, in a confession at a local church, the man admitted that when he found his spouse, she was still alive and even tried to talk to him, but immediately collapsed and died. Detectives also had suspicions that the crime victim was having a relationship with another man on the side. She was about to leave her husband and had been communicating with her ex-boyfriend, named Scott, for some time. However, the nature of their correspondence indicated that they had just started communicating, and there was no intimacy between them. During opening statements at the trial, the defense emphasized to the jury that investigators initially focused all their attention on the evidence against Raven Abaroa. Police did not pursue other possible suspects and ignored several pieces of evidence. First, a fingerprint found on a closet did not belong to either the victim or her husband, Raven Abaroa. Second, a bloodstain found on the front door did not match either person's DNA. A third important piece of evidence that was overlooked was a shoe print left by the suspect when he stepped in the victim's blood. It was located near the body. The prosecution based its tactics on the fact that the victim's husband was manipulative, aggressive, and suffered from mood swings. One of the victim's friends said she suspected he had a mental disorder. One of the girls who was Raven's lover revealed that he was quite meticulous and calculating, using several phone numbers to contact girls on the side. This could indicate that he carefully planned the murder and could indeed successfully mislead the police. The same girl later admitted that Raven once forced her to have sex with her in a car literally on the side of the road. He behaved quite aggressively, so the lover had to comply. She even left a lock of her hair in the car in case something happened to her. All this had to have a good reason. Not every girl goes on a date and deliberately leaves samples of her DNA in a guy's car so that these traces can be used to prove his involvement in something bad. She was clearly afraid for her life, which she told the jury. One of the possible motives for the crime, according to the prosecutor, was Janet's unplanned pregnancy. She told only the closest people about it, including several of her sisters. Janet was so happy to be a mother, but clearly did not think her husband was the best father for her children. The news, given their dire financial situation, led the prosecution to suggest that Raven Abaroa might have been upset by the news of the impending addition to the family. Due to the new revelations, the defense filed a motion to cancel the trial because the characters of the victim and the defendant were not fully reflected. That motion was granted, and the next phase of the trial was set for March 2014. By this point, Raven had struck a deal with the prosecution and pleaded guilty to the manslaughter of his wife.
I wish that I could address some of the things that the Christiansons and Ms. Dow have said, but I don't think this is the appropriate time or place for that. So I would just like to state that I didn't receive a fair trial the first time. I don't think I'll receive a fair trial the second time. And the fact is, I love my family very much. And I don't think it's worth risking the possibility of spending the rest of my life in prison for something I didn't do. I take this plea to ensure that that doesn't happen. And that's the only reason I did not kill my wife.
On that basis, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison with parole eligibility after 8 years. The 4 years he had already spent in prison awaiting sentencing were counted. Raven Abaroa was released from prison on Christmas Day, 2017.